Well, after about 2 months of daily driving, the freshly installed bottom bracket has had it. So let's take it apart and see what exactly failed. Let me show you one thing which was there right from the beginning. There's a terrible wobble in the drive gear. You can see it, how badly it's wobbling back and forth. And that actually made the chain tighten and untighten as I was running the bike, which was not very good, which is not very good for the chain because you can't properly tighten it. And the next thing that you actually have for a problem is that this thing is constantly having side forces on it. And that made the next problem come up. I had to let this thing be welded onto the pedal, because at one point I was, pedaling along, and then suddenly this thing it wasn't tightly on here anymore. And I basically had like a neutral gear on here, so I could pedal, but this thing wasn't moving anywhere. So in the middle of nowhere I had to find a welding shop, which then welded this onto me here. Next thing I had to complain about was this thing constantly getting play in it. I even went so far in changing the cups out because I thought they might be worn. But every 30 to 40 kilometers or so I had to retighten this, which was really annoying, and also was quite thrilling actually, because this tightening nut here is so thin that it's going to wear out the threads on here, not only because it's a thin nut, but because it's also a sloppy nut, and because this steel is damn soft, So next thing that happened was this pedal here loosened up and got wiggly back and forth and couldn't be tightened back on again. When you take a look at here, this is really badly scored by the force of pedaling onto this crank. So the drive pin here, the cotter pin, actually wore itself into the shaft here, which actually is quite a common problem with these when they're installed backwards. You can see here that the flat on here is thinner on one side than on the other. So when you have them installed with a thinner side pointing down, then your pedaling force, as you're pedaling in this direction, your pedaling force is all exerting on this small point, which will then wear this pattern into here. But I had them installed the right way, which is with the big side down. So, it's just badly made, this thing. And after I had this pedal off and saw this bad wearing here, I decided this had to come off. And as you can see now, I am having problems getting the crank from the other side off, because it has worn itself into the shaft. Let's examine what this thing looks like. Shaft first of all, also the other pedal side badly worn, just as this one. the threads are completely stripped on one part, which is where the nut went on. You saw there that I didn't really get the cone off, which should spin on there by hand, but I actually had to use some pliers. Now let's take a look at the cones. You know, this thing has barely run maybe 200 kilometers or so. And you can see that this raceway here is not one raceway, but it has actually already worn a deep trace into there. You can see that step there. It's absolutely hilarious. These things, they aren't hardened, okay? Same with the cones, which have run even less, but you can already see the wearing trace where the balls have run in. And of course it's the same thing with the cone on here. You have deep wear traces, and I will do a photo of that so you can have a better look at that. Now, the race cages, well, one is okay, but the other one is already falling apart. Can you see that? The balls are barely held in here, and I can push these out by hand. Actually, 2 or 3 were actually laying in there loose. So it would have been only a matter of time, maybe 2-3 weeks more, and the balls would have actually caught inside the cage and rimpled this whole thing to shreds. Of course, this nut, way too thin, way too wiggly to be able to hold this in, and it's barely threading onto here anymore because the threads are so stripped, you know. So yeah, it's time for this thing to come out. Maybe with hardened raceways, these old Thompson style bottom brackets wouldn't be that bad, and they're still available like that. But then you have to go for old stock, which is available for just around 100 euros a piece, or you have to buy a used one, which is already worn in. So that's no real alternative for me. So what I did was I bought this, which is basically a shaft with standard bearings on here. And then the way you would mount these is with these plastic shells. They get punched into the frame, just like the old racing cups would be, and then the bearing would mount inside. I do not trust plastic. I know that plastic has gotten really strong over time, but I'm just not confident of that. You know, I'm pushing on here with my full body weight. When this is the axle, here's the pedal, and I'm pedaling on there with my full body weight, and I could imagine that these wear out quite quickly. So what I did was I remachined these out of aluminium, and I made one a tight fit on here, so it's not going off, and the other one well, it's still a quite tight fit, but it's a sliding fit. You can see that this can move on here. First of all, because you can't machine this exactly to fit the bottom of the bike, and second, so that you have a little bit of adjustment in width for play, and so that the bearings in here don't get wedged together, because these are just straight bearings, and originally they were like angular bearings, so they would get adjusted through side force. And these are not so tolerant about side force. So to take out the side force, this one is a slide fit on here. So this basically just gets punched into there, and with properly hardened raceways, I could imagine that this works quite well. brute force didn't really pay out here, so I had to change plans. My idea first was to just pound on the axle, but all that did was drive the axle in and thus this bearing shell out. So we weren't getting anywhere there. So what I did here was take the old chuck which was on my lathe, and yes, I know this is extremely unorthodox, but that's all I had with a fitting bore in there. I didn't have anything with a larger hole drilled into it and a suitable width. So really excuse me, but I had to do it and I was very carefully. So I slid this onto here and then punched onto this surface here with an aluminium hammer, and thereby drove this shell onto the piece. So this is now in here and it's nice and freely. So the next thing we have to do is get the chain blade on. By the way, I'm of course not going to reuse the old pedals or the new pedals, but I'm going for this. It's from a company named Gazelle. They're Netherlands and they're #1 bike production factory, so I'm expecting these to be great. And of course they're old, so they have to be great, right? I didn't really go into detail there on the previous episode, but these things are held in by these cotter pins. So put this onto here, and then there's a flat milled onto here, which the cottered pin rides on inside this. So this goes onto here, and the cottered pin then goes into the flat. Like so. You have to pay attention that the wider surface is on the bottom, because as you're pedaling down onto here against the force of the axle, which wants to stand still, the force goes on the lower part, and therefore you need as much wear surface as you can. So always put these cottered pins in this way. Okay, let's install the other pedal arm. Let's put a grease Now, as you tighten, you need to simultaneously hammer it from the other side. So you gave way a little bit here. You do that until you feel that it doesn't get loose on the other side here. This nut is not there to pull the pin in, but it's actually there to hold it and keep it from falling out. And now we've got this side sorted. So now we mount the pedals.